Hello, I'm John Oxer. It's the 28th of June. We're at the Adams Mark Hotel in Denver, Colorado, and I'm here for the purpose of interviewing my old friend and scientific collaborator, Art.
What's my name?
What is your name? Art Lucas, who we've got pinned down finally in one place. Art, let's talk a little bit about how you came into the world, where in the first few years.
Well, we can run real quickly through the country stuff. I was born in Indianapolis, you know, the home of the great race, and grew up down in the country in the south of Indiana on a farm by the shores of the Muscatatuck River. Try to say that over and over. I escaped to go to college when I was 18 years old, and I don't think I ever really went back overnight. Got a couple of years of college in at Franklin College, and an old alumnus came by searching for somebody to work hard, and I needed money. So I went to work for the General Electric Company in Milwaukee, and that started a part of my life that the Health Physics Society knows very little about, and I think it's worthwhile to spend some time there because I think we did some fairly good things. And I've brought a few documents to remind me because I never did have a good memory. The first thing that I was set out to do in this career was to build a water tank so as to explore the deposition of X-ray energy in the human body for the treatment of cancer. And I believe this is the first time this was ever done. We built a tank. It's not necessary to see that. We built a tank which was 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet. We could then direct the X-ray beam into this tank, and with small ionization chambers we could map the dose in there. And we set the pace for radiotherapy for all time. Nowadays that kind of thing is done routinely. There's a big business that goes on about building dose plotters and whatnot. But our group, and the head of that group was a man named Dale Trout, who was one of the founders of the Health Physics Society. He was a very imaginative guy.
And a wonderful person.
Yeah, indeed, he was so much fun. When he did these things, they just came out like magic because he could tell stories until you wouldn't believe it. So we did some of that, and I think even the medical physics people have kind of forgotten who started this depth dose kind of thing. But the thing that we accomplished there that the medical physics people have not forgotten is that we learned how to characterize the penetrating ability of X-rays for radiotherapy. Many years ago, a German fellow named T. Christen, and I do not know what the T stands for, but Christen created the idea of measuring the half-value layer, the amount of something you add to an X-ray beam to make it go to half as much. Well, I was young and impetuous and critical, and I knew everything. You know, at that age, you know, when you're about 20 years old, you really know a lot. And I kept going to Dr. Trout saying, oh, you know, this is not right. This is not the way you should do it, you know. And he finally said, well, if you think it should be done differently, then let's really do it well. And we engaged a program to measure the half-value layer uniquely and independent of geometry. And it really shocked people in the profession to the point that the paper that we published is taught to this day by the guys in the medical schools. There has been no better reference in all this time.
And where did you publish that? This
was published probably in radiology. It was either, no, this was the American Journal of Röntgenology, which we called it the Yellow Journal. There was a white journal and a yellow journal. And a lot of this stuff was published in radiology. A lot of it was published in the American Journal of Röntgenology, and on and on and on. that was a really good lab, and we made major contributions to treating cancer more precisely, to reducing patient dose in radiography, chest x-rays, things like this. How do you get that dose down so you can make more chest radiographs without worrying about the x-ray exposure to the population? Well, like all good men of that time, eventually I had to admit to the draft board that I should go to the Army. So in that period I took 2 years off and went to the Army, where I taught electronics at Fort Bliss down at
Texas.
down Texas, down in El Paso. This was kind of a great experience, and I look back on it with great fondness, to the extent that at the end of my duty, which would have been the spring of 1957, every commander of a Nike missile site in the world had been taught electronics by myself and 3 of my buddies. And I thought that was pretty good. We were, I don't know if we were winning a war. I think we did win that war, but we were sure working at it. Well, on and on. Now what you'll find if you look at my resume, John, is that I get sort of antsy about every 10 years and I change jobs. You know how it goes. Your mind wanders. So in due time, I moved for a reason I know not what, except a wanderlust.
Or climate.
Climate, yes, climate. I moved to Santa Barbara, California. Not bad from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, I don't know that I ever did better work there than I did in Milwaukee, but did some very unusual things. And again, just to keep my mind straight here and help me remember some of the things we did, I just dug a few old pictures out of the archives. Worked for a company called EG&G. A lot of our peers would know EG&G, and we did a lot of things.
Can we zoom in on these pictures if we hold them right? Why don't you talk about that one?
Let's, okay. How about I put him right there?
No, this camera.
This camera. Okay, these are, well, first of all, that's me when I had hair. Yeah. And I also weighed about 60 pounds less, and that's the way it was. This is, in the center is the man who was head of EG&G's Santa Barbara laboratories in those days, Osmond T. Fundingsland.
Remembering.
Yeah, he's a man worth remembering. And on the left in this picture is the technical director of the lab, Charlie Hatcher, who went on to become head of a division at Los Alamos. And this is a snapshot of the 3 of us in the control room to the linear accelerator, which we built there in my time. And that was my first brush with big plumbing particle accelerators, and it worked out pretty good from the point of view of my doing what they wanted, and my getting an education in big particle accelerators.
But right about then is when you switched also to doing dosimetric research with the small detectors, right? And the big detectors, really. That's
right. Now, John, coming from back at GE, I always had an affection for ion chambers. As a matter of fact, when you guys at Oak Ridge were counting beta rays and counting alpha rays and all that sort of thing, I didn't have any counters, and I didn't know how to do that. And when we had to measure beta rays, the only thing I knew was to build an electrometer which would measure very small currents and build an ion chamber. Now, everywhere I turned, everything looked like an ion chamber. So the first time we did wipe testing in the Dale Trout Laboratory, I had taken a salad bowl, a 14-inch salad bowl, and in those days my wife had silk stockings, and No, it was nylon.
Nylon.
No, it was nylon. And I stretched this nylon stocking across the front of it, and I smeared DAG across it to make it conducting. I set it on 3 little posts. Then I built an electrometer using the old vacuum tube electrometer tubes, 5889, I believe. Yep. And we were able to measure 305 microcuries in wipe testing with an ion chamber. So when I got out in Santa Barbara, I was really trademarked. Everybody understood that ART could not resist making an ion chamber out of every volumetric contraption that showed up. And this is kind of a selection of the ion chamber things that I did. The ball on the right is a 40-liter ion chamber. It had tremendous sensitivity. You could measure background radiation, duck soup, and its little brother a bit to the left is a 12-liter ion chamber. Then there's a 100 cc ion chamber on the right, and down in the front there's a 1 cc ion chamber. I just, really kept going, building ion chambers when no one else would. The 1 cc it became fairly famous. It was the material was designed by Francis Schonke up at St. Procopius College.
Tissue equivalent.
Tissue equivalent, the whole thing, and that kind of thing became sort of a world standard. Now, at about that time, EG&G touched base with 2 rather important figures. You see, EG&G was a Boston-based firm.
Yes.
And the E and the G and the G had all been MIT folk. Well, it turns out Robley Evans was an MIT person, and Robley Evans came to Santa Barbara to talk to us about our future and what we ought to be doing and this and that. And then Harold Rossi came, and the 2 each reviewed the laboratory. Well, the most significant thing that came out of those visits was, you see, Harold Rossi was the father of the tissue equivalent proportional counter in microdosimetry. Well, Harold allowed us how we could probably build a proportional counter like his with about a 1 or 2 year development program, but we'd never be able to make a commercial product out of it. Well, we took 90 days. Be nice if you could see that. We took 90 days. Well, we took 90 days to build a proportional counter. I took every advantage because I'm kind of success-oriented. We built a 2-inch diameter sphere of tissue equivalent plastic, but I put it in an aluminum container, and it worked like a dream. You could seal it off, you could take it to the desert, you could take it to an accelerator, you could really make measurements with it. And Harold was very complimentary over this because it got this thing to be really world famous. And to this day, there's a small company in Santa Barbara that builds these things and sells them, and they're used in every research laboratory in the world. I thought that was kind of neat that we were able to do that because, as you know, Harold Rossi is no longer with us, and as are some other people. Now, just another little commentary on the people there in Santa Barbara. It was a pretty aggressive time. I did want you to see that I did have hair, and I was skinny in those days.
I remember.
You see on the left. See, I'm still coherent enough I can read through a picture on the back and figure out which is left and which is right, John. On the left, you see John Handloser, who was one of us, a fairly well-known guy who did nice work at Brookhaven and worked with us in Santa Barbara and went on to build a pretty significant company, and more recently is deceased. And on the right, you see Henry Barella, who was the technical director of that lab for some time. These were really interesting times there in Santa Barbara. And as our other friends probably know, there was a lot of weapons orientation toward what EG&G did in those days. But I felt rather lucky that I did some things that were outside that scope. And probably the most significant thing that I did during that about 10-year period was to undertake with that proportional counter measuring the LET spectrum from neutron irradiations. You remember the Henry Tower. You put a big neutron generator on top of this tower, and I went out in the desert with a pickup truck and measured neutron spectra out there in the sand. Well, Colonel Brennan, who had given birth to the AFRI down in Bethesda, came out there to see me, and he wanted to undertake with this kind of technology determining the advisability of undertaking a clinical trial in cancer radiotherapy. Got a team of 6 together. My job was to make these measurements, these spectral measurements. We went to every serious neutron generator in the world. We went first to Hammersmith in London. We went to Livermore, a thing called the CT machine, I guess it was called. We went to AFRI, where we had a trigger reactor, and we opened up the cyclotron at Texas A&M. We were the very first user from outside Texas A&M. And with all this data, we were able to show the medical profession a way to undertake a clinical trial, and several clinical trials were engaged. And I thought that was okay. And then as a spin-off from that, over at Los Alamos, there was a big push to build a large proton accelerator, LAMP. And there was a dream that you could potentially treat cancer with negative pi mesons. This had been predicted as a possibility by Peter Fowler. Just remembered the name. Peter Fowler, who was the brother of Jack Fowler. Peter Fowler was a famous particle physicist, and Jack Fowler was one of us. He was a dosimetry guy. Peter Fowler had predicted that if you could harness negative pi mesons, you could potentially treat cancer with them nicely. So this was a real opportunity. Jack Woods down at Germantown came to me and said, could you take your gadgets and go to Berkeley and try to characterize a negative pi meson beam? I said, well, you know, anything for $1.
Or adventure.
Oh yeah, or adventure. Now this was really, John, you got to admit, this is really cool. Going to use the cyclotron that was created by the master. This was Ernie Lawrence's biggest cyclotron, his greatest cyclotron, the one that saw us through the war, the Manhattan Project, and I got to go have it for 3 days. I did not sleep, John. I did not sleep. All I did was drink coffee and pace the floor for 3 days while we were making these measurements. And it was a really good experience. And I remember my feeling of admiration for the cyclotron people. It was it was after midnight one night. You see, if you're going to properly infer the signal attributable to negative pi mesons, you have got to look at the background attributable to positive pi mesons and other things. So I had been alerted that I'd better do positive pi mesons also. So a little after midnight, it was dark and I was heavy into the coffee, we finished the last negative pi meson run. So not knowing any better, I didn't know anything about accelerators. I went over to the operator and I said, now I want positive pi mesons. I didn't know anything else to say. Yeah. So this salty old guy looked up at me, kind of scowling, and he said, you mean you want me to turn all the magnets around? Good. Yes, that's what I want. Well, John, it was absolutely fantastic. He started pressing buttons like this. You know, those things run on big motor generator sets, and you can hear these big motor generator sets. They're going, like that. Boom. This guy runs off, and he's clanging doors, and lights are flashing, and this and that and the other. About 30 minutes, he's at the control, and he looks back up at me, and he says, "We got beam." And I just thought that was a tremendous tribute to what really makes nuclear physics work. Those guys know how to run these things. Anyway, we got the data that showed that you can get fair result with negative pi mesons. Lampf at Los Alamos went on to build a beam line that treated patients, and I guess it was pretty successful. But the problem is it's just so expensive. That it was never really pursued greatly. I don't know that that beam line runs anymore. I could be wrong. Well, so that's kind of the way things went in Santa Barbara, and
So then you ran away for a while.
yeah, I ran away. Oh yeah, we neglected to talk about TLD, didn't we?
Yeah, we ought to cover that before you go to NIST.
That's right. We well, what had happened is in about 1961, EG&G had gotten a contract from the nuclear Navy to build a personnel dosimeter using thermoluminescence in a manner that had been prescribed by the Naval Research Laboratory. So I was not directly involved in that, except that I was offsides using the materials which they produced for other purposes at the laboratory. So I gained a lot of experience in using thermoluminescence materials. Used them to measure radiation exposure to rodents in the Nevada desert, this and that sort of thing. That was kind of fun, and got quite a bit of experience. Well, the project went forward, but it failed. They built this instrument, and they went to show it to Rickover, and it failed. It didn't work. But they were sure, the Navy was sure that that's what they wanted. Well, having a little bit of insight into these things, I began to build instruments for commercial use, which would involve the measurement of thermoluminescence, and that's kind of a front view of the first EG&G TLD reader, and we began to talk with the Navy about how to do this. Well, I had been very successful, and I had a lot of credibility with Dr. Hatcher, the technical head of the laboratory, and one day he said to me, "Art, you can do whatever you want to do, just tell me what it is." And I said, "Well, Charlie, I'd like to go work for a year of my life at the Mecca, the National Bureau of Standards, which is now called NIST." He says, "Well, okay, you have a leave, you can go, we'll pay your way there, we'll pay your way back. They have to pay your salary." So I became a government employee, a GS something, for a year. Worked at the Bureau of Standards, where we did, I can't remember what we did. Oh, we engaged a program to isolate monoenergetic X-rays from big machine beams.
Yeah.
K-X-ray, it was the K-X-ray thing. And that turned out to be the forerunner to some really good work in later years in imaging for medical purposes at the NIST. So I had gotten some distance in thermoluminescence. Came back to the lab from Gaithersburg, and by this time the Navy had decided what it wanted for a dosimeter. So it had put out a request for bid, and everybody answered it. Well, EG&G answered it, and a company called the Harshaw Chemical Company in Cleveland, Ohio, who had started to produce instruments of this sort, answered it. Well, EG&G did not win the bid. So I was encouraged by both the Navy and Harshaw to go to work for Harshaw in Cleveland, Ohio. It was a matter of great conscience, because my family really enjoyed Santa Barbara. Now, I mean, you know, Santa Barbara, I guess everybody knows what Santa Barbara is like, but just a little glimpse. Look, see that little white cloud floating in the sky up there? See that mountain ridge behind my house? All those good things. I mean, Santa Barbara was good life. And I said no. Well, I said no about 3 times, and it got to be embarrassing. I was afraid that I was going to let Admiral Rickover down and scuttle the nuclear navy and lose the Cold War. So finally, one Sunday afternoon, I owed Harshaw a telephone call, and it was at the epitome of Santa Barbara luxury. I was sitting in a chair beside the pool, watching all the young ladies flit back and forth in, you know how they dress when they go to the pool in Santa Barbara. It's just really embarrassing. I'm sitting there staring into the sky trying to decide, shall I move to Cleveland, Ohio? Well, I decided to do it. Now, how are we doing on time, Jan? What do you think? Well, should we keep this up or not?
Let's just go quickly through that.
We'll just skip right along here.
All right.
Because most people out there know what I did after I came to Cleveland.
Yeah.
Because in Santa Barbara, we had created a little kind of a dosimeter that was in a glass bulb, and this was rather the basis for the Navy dosimeter, and it was rather crude in some ways. And so the decision was made to try to make a mil-spec device which resembled that. And we went ahead to do that. I went to work for the Harshaw Chemical Company. We created this device which came to be worn by every man who sailed in the nuclear navy. There was somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million of these produced. And no one ever produced them except ourselves, myself and a lady who later came to be my wife. You see that, there's some calcium fluoride encapsulated in a bottle with an inert gas, and there's a lead coming out each end, which is different than the way EG&G had designed it. And it all fits down in this little case. And this came to be a very famous way of monitoring the radiation exposure to the Navy personnel. To this day, if you get about 20 people in a room in our profession, you can find at least one guy who has worn that dosimeter and will tell you stories about it. Well, I'm really proud of that. That was a major contribution to personnel dosimetry in our profession. We went on to do a lot of other things. They're the card dosimeters which we use to make commercial devices at Harshaw. And I spent 13 years at Harshaw in growing crystals, creating instruments, this and that kind of thing. Kind of thing our friends out there know a lot about. And then I moved on to Victorine, where again it was instruments and commercial stuff and developing and all that. I think that's pretty much a glimpse of my life, John.
Well, Art, I've always thought of you as a premier electronic physicist, instrumentation innovator. Like you said, when nobody else could do it, you did it. But when did you begin to think of yourself as a health physicist more than an electronic physicist?
That's a good point. When I was at GE, Dale Trout helped KZ and all those people to put together the Health Physics Society, and his philosophy was that I and my peers should participate in the professional activity out there, and by way of that, my peer John Kelly and I belonged to the, I have to be careful, I'm not sure what we belonged to. We belonged to the IRE, the Institute of Radio Engineers, which later became the IEEE. Yeah. And so when the HPS came along, we joined the HPS as a part of being a part of the community out there. Then when they started to certify people by examination, you see, Dale Trout thought he was old enough to be grandfathered, so he was grandfathered. And he thought my peer, John Kelly, was old enough to be grandfathered, but he was not much older than I was. But he didn't think I was old enough to be grandfathered. I think his words were, at least one of us ought to take the test. So
you got elected.
I took the first examination in radiation safety ever given. 23 of us did. 7 of us passed. And John, I tell all my friends, and I think it's the truth, unless the other 6 guys come back to challenge it, I was the first guy to get up and pass in my paper. So I claim to be the first one. 7 of us passed.
Now that would have been in 1961.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And incidentally, just as a note added for one of your mentors, Elda Anderson, as I recall, Elda Anderson proctored this examination. And, you know, we didn't know what was going to be on this exam, so we couldn't study for it. We could just kind of know general stuff. And, you know, there were a lot of questions I didn't think I could answer. And I shrugged my shoulders, and I got up, and I handed in my paper, and I was putting on my top coat. I turned around, and Elda came up to me, and she said, "Mr. Lucas, surely you know more than this. Will you just sit back down there and answer the rest of the questions?"
Now that was Elda.
That was Elda. That was my one and only experience with Elda Anderson, and I look at her that way for the rest of my life. And I guess I answered enough questions to pass. But at that point, I began to think in terms of radiation safety and measurements for radiation safety and so forth. And a lot of my publications in later years were orientated toward that.
Now, one of the things you haven't talked about yet, though, that you had a hand in, was the making of the dosimeters for civil defense related things, the electrometers. How big a role did you play there, or were you just an advisor?
Well, in the electronic ones, the survey meters, the CDV 720s and so forth, I did not help with that.
No, I was talking about the electrometer, the pocket electrometers.
The quartz fiber, or the fiber dosimeters, yes. Well, what happened there was that I'd helped to get that contract, and the project proceeded quite well at Victorine, but it was a little too bureaucratic, and instead of the fiber dosimeters costing $20, they were costing $200. So that's where I became engaged in building the fiber dosimeters very efficiently and to specification. And before I was finished, we were able to make the civil defense dosimeters for about $18 or $20. And that was a notable achievement, I think.
Now, you've mentioned a lot of the key people in your lives, and Dale Trout being one of the magnificent ones. But going back before that, was anybody in your school life, any great teacher jump out at you that had some influence in steering you to where you went?
Well, my high school science teacher was really okay, Charlie Bard. And I don't know if I can still tell this story properly, but Charlie Bard really stimulated me to do scientific things. And I was really, I'm really honored by his deathbed words. In a few weeks before he died, he was interviewed by the county newspaper. In the county newspaper, well, was there any student in your life who was really great? And Mr. Bard said, he was always known as Mr. Bard. I didn't call him Charlie Bard to his face, because, you know, you don't do that. He said, well, there was Orson Welles and Art Lucas and my daughter Patricia. And I thought that was pretty good company.
Yeah, I think it is too. I don't know Patricia.
You don't know Patricia. She was okay. But you know the character of Orson Welles.
Oh, yes.
And he learned his science from the same guy I learned my science from. I thought that was pretty good company.
And I have one other key question that it's on my mind a lot lately, and I think maybe on yours. Now, you've been in the profession a long time, both of us, and we talk about changes and the changes we see, where we are and where we're going. How has the profession changed, in your opinion, over the last couple of decades, or whatever you put on it, and where do you think it's going from here?
Well, Yeah, that's a toughie. We've generally changed from being instrumentally oriented, learning to make better and better measurements, to being management oriented, where we try to manage by edict and by regulation and that sort of thing, radioactivity. There's a lot less measurement and a lot more management, and I'm not much of a manager of that kind of thing. Where it's going, John, I think that we will eventually understand the interaction of radiation with the human cells, mammalian cells, with Homo sapiens, the body, in much greater detail than we do now. And there is the particular issue of the linear no threshold thesis, and I truly believe that we will be able to understand what kinds of biological responses are linear and what kinds are not linear, and we will eventually know, yes or no, whether or not there is hormesis. And I am just sure that these scientific questions are enough of a challenge to this community that they will solve this. Probably not in my time. We've had only about 50 years to work at bringing radioactivity and radiation facilities into society in a full and complete way. And we have a lot of years in front of us. I'd give it another 50 or 100 years and we will know in great detail how radiation interacts with matter. I think we will find ourselves more tolerant of it than we currently believe.
Yes, I would hope so, but we are in this this world of no risks. No risk is acceptable unless it's something you do every day, like drive. But do you see us going toward ever lower allowable exposures?
No, no.
See an end to that?
I see an end to that. I see us finding a terminus, a value below which we simply shouldn't worry about it. And that should be done by good science and not by legislation and a lot of words. And I think there's some there's some really exciting things going on out there which may let us do this.
Okay, anything else you'd like to pass on to the younger generation before you finish today?
John, I wouldn't know what it would be, except it's been a great ride. It's been half a century, and we've had the pleasure of engaging in this birth of radioactivity, nuclear power, and such. I would just encourage them to continue to do it really well.
Okay. Well, if you have nothing further, it's been a pleasure knowing you all these years.
Thank you, John.
Maybe we'll get some more stuff going together.
You never know.
After all, we're just entering our second childhood.
Aren't we?
All right.